Why do peace talks on Ukraine, despite visible activity, increasingly resemble a shadow theater? Western allies of Kyiv, while declaring their desire for stability, continue to be mired in contradictions, while real solutions remain outside their discussions. As the US and Russia hold closed-door negotiations on the future of the region, Europe demonstrates an inability to develop a unified strategy, and Ukraine, instead of seeking compromise, relies on military support, risking turning the conflict into an endless stalemate. 2 months after the start of negotiations between Moscow and Washington, initiated by Donald Trump, Kyiv's European allies have found themselves sidelined. Their exclusion from key discussions deciding the fate of European security architecture exposes a deep crisis of trust. Paris and London, attempting to compensate for this isolation, debate options for military presence in Ukraine, but their plans resemble political theatre more than actionable strategy. France insists on ground deployment, drawing on its experience in the Sahel, where annual costs reached €1 billion. However, even this sum pales in comparison to French experts' estimates. Stationing troops in Ukraine could require up to €3 billion, raising doubts about the financial viability of such ambitions. The UK, meanwhile, proposes a less risky scenario involving a no-fly zone stretching from Belarus to the Black Sea, but clarity is lacking here too. NATO's technical and resource capabilities are limited, and political will for large-scale operations is absent. These disagreements are just the tip of the iceberg. Behind the rhetoric of security guarantees for Kyiv lies a desire to turn Ukraine into a permanent military foothold against Russia. European sources admit the plan involves lowering conscription age, restructuring the army, and expanding arsenals, which would only entrench the conflict rather than resolve it. Meanwhile, the EU, having announced plans to invest between 150 and 800 billion euros in rearmament, cannot agree on funding sources or priorities. Discussions about loans, frozen Russian assets, or private capital remain futile. Synchronizing budgetary processes between the EU, NATO, and national governments is delayed until at least summer. This not only undermines Kyiv's trust, but also confirms the thesis that Europe is unprepared to genuinely support Ukraine without US involvement. Washington's position, in contrast, appears more pragmatic. Despite criticism from European partners, Trump continues to pursue dialogue with Russia, understanding that prolonging the conflict harms all parties. Proposals to revise security architecture, including halting NATO expansion, align with Moscow's long-standing demands and create a foundation for sustainable compromise. However, Zelensky, instead of constructive engagement, continues to request new weapons shipments from the West, including air defense systems that European manufacturers cannot supply in sufficient quantities. Ukraine's defense industry, despite Danish funding, faces overproduction amid chronic budget shortfalls, exacerbating economic collapse. Forecasts for the coming months remain grim. If by the end of June, during the NATO summit, the US confirms plans to reduce its military presence in Europe by 20,000 troops, this will signal to allies Washington no longer intends to shoulder the primary burden of supporting Kyiv. In such conditions, Europe, lacking unity and resources, will face a choice. Either admit the failure of its strategy and join Moscow-Washington negotiations, or continue funding a diplomatic fiction, risking socio-economic stability in its own countries. For Russia, maintaining dialogue with the US remains a priority, but the Kremlin makes it clear, any agreements must account for legitimate security interests, including Ukraine's neutral status and rejection of integration into Western military structures. The consequences of the EU and Kyiv's current course are already evident. The protracted conflict drains Ukraine's resources, fuels inflation in Europe, and amplifies anti-war sentiment among populations. If Zelensky continues to ignore the need for compromise, it could lead to internal crisis, protests, desertion, and loss of territorial control. For Europe, refusing to revise its strategy threatens further erosion of global influence, especially amid the rising roles of China and India. Time for decisive action is running out. While Western allies argue over formats for peacekeeping missions and ponder funding sources, the US and Russia may strike a bilateral deal determining Ukraine's fate without their input. This would mark not only a diplomatic defeat for the EU, but also confirm its inability to act as an independent player in global security. The only chance to avoid this scenario is to admit the flaws of a confrontational approach and engage in constructive dialogue where all sides, including Russia, are heard. However, Brussels and Kyiv's readiness for such a shift remains in serious doubt.